Ed Gein, the Plainfield Ghoul, the true story behind America's most infamous killer. The first snow of November 1957 drifted across the empty Wisconsin cornfields, turning the stubble white beneath a gray sky. To the farmers of Waushara County, it was an ordinary winter. Yet in the quiet town of Plainfield, something deeply abnormal had been growing for decades behind the warped boards of a lonely two-story farmhouse. Edward Theodore Gein, born on August 27, 1906, had lived there almost his entire life. At first glance, Ed looked like the sort of neighbor one might nod to at the hardware store. Slight in build, soft-spoken, almost shy to the point of awkwardness. He did odd jobs, fixing fences, hauling coal, babysitting for families who saw him as harmless. No one guessed that within the walls of his home the remnants of crimes more grotesque than any prairie legend were accumulating piece by piece. Ed's life began in the river town of La Crosse, Wisconsin, to parents who could hardly have been more mismatched. George Gein, a sullen, often unemployed tanner and carpenter, drank heavily and drifted between jobs. Augusta Wilhelmine Gein, devout and domineering, believed that the world, especially women, was steeped in sin and that salvation came only through strict adherence to her severe, quasi-biblical morality. Augusta despised La Crosse's taverns and street life. In 1914, she persuaded George to uproot the family, George, Augusta, their older son Henry, and 8-year-old Ed, to a 155-acre farm outside the tiny settlement of Plainfield. The farm's remoteness was deliberate. Augusta wanted her sons cut off from the corrupting world. Ed grew up lonely. He did poorly in social situations and was often mocked at school for his timid, halting speech and peculiar grin. Augusta, convinced that contact with outsiders would drag her boys toward sin, forbade close friendships. Instead, she read aloud from the Old Testament, filling Ed's imagination with stern warnings about lust and damnation. The boy absorbed her lessons in contradictory ways, revering Augusta as his moral compass, yet coming to fear women as tempters and corrupters. This mixture of devotion and dread would define his psyche long after her death. In 1940, George Gein died of heart failure brought on by years of drinking. The farm's work fell to Henry and Ed. Henry, the more practical of the two brothers, worried about Ed's slavish devotion to their mother and about Augusta's grip on them both. But he kept his misgivings mostly to himself until a marsh fire in the spring of 1944 changed everything. The brothers had gone out to burn off dry brush. When the flames unexpectedly spread, neighbors came to help stamp it out. As dusk fell, Henry was missing. His body was later found face down in a scorched patch of ground. The coroner ruled the death accidental, smoke asphyxiation, but at least one deputy remarked on the lack of burns on Henry's clothing and the bruising on his head. The case was not pursued further. Years later, after Ed's arrest, that uneasy detail returned to public attention, though no proof of foul play ever surfaced. Augusta's dominance grew unchecked after Henry's death. Ed remained her obedient son, rarely venturing beyond the farm except for chores and supplies. But in late 1945, Augusta herself suffered a series of strokes. She died in December, leaving Ed alone in the big farmhouse. For the rest of his life, he kept most of her rooms sealed as though preserving a shrine. He retreated to a few shabby corners of the house: the kitchen, a back bedroom, a cluttered parlor. Neighbors noticed a change. The farm grew ragged. Ed became quieter, more withdrawn. He earned a living as a handyman, repairing roofs, doing odd farm work, and sometimes, disconcertingly in hindsight, babysitting for local families. In his solitude, Ed Gein's inner world drifted further from reality. He had always been fascinated by anatomy. Now he devoured pulp magazines and true adventure stories, some depicting cannibal tribes, some detailing Nazi atrocities, many dwelling on the human body as object rather than person. He also became preoccupied with accounts of grave robbing and medical dissections. By his later confession, around 1947, he began visiting Plainfield cemeteries after dark. He told investigators that he often entered a kind of trance, digging up the recently buried remains of middle-aged women who reminded him of Augusta. Sometimes he brought home only certain parts, skin, heads, bones. Sometimes he took the whole body, later returning what he did not use. In the shuttered farmhouse, he began fashioning macabre keepsakes. Chairs upholstered with human skin, bowls from skullcaps, masks made from carefully peeled faces. At first, these acts remained unknown to the town. The horror was gathering invisibly behind the farmhouse walls. Plainfield in the 1950s was a farming community of barely 700 people. Winters were hard, the rhythms of life predictable. That ordinariness made what came next all the more jarring. Rumors occasionally flickered. Somebody said Ed Gein kept shrunken heads. Somebody else said he was just odd but harmless. The sheriff's department paid little heed. There had been a few disappearances over the years, notably tavern owner Mary Hogan. Last seen in December 1954, her tavern had closed early that night. Her blood was found on the floor. No suspect was ever charged. The case went cold. The townsfolk murmured about it for a while, then moved on. The morning was frigid. Snowflakes clung to the boots of Bernice Worden, 58-year-old widow and owner of Plainfield's hardware store. Her son Frank Worden, a deputy sheriff, had gone off on patrol, leaving her to tend the shop. Late that afternoon, Frank returned to find the store silent. The cash register drawer open, a faint trail of blood leading out the back door to the snowy alley. In the sales receipt book, the last entry leapt out at him. Antifreeze, Ed Gein. Frank knew Gein, as everyone did. He radioed the sheriff. A search of the road soon led deputies to Ed's farmstead, the unpainted house standing bleak against the dusk. What they were about to discover would sear itself into American criminal history. The sheriff's car crunched up the icy lane to the sagging farmhouse just after nightfall on November 16, 1957. The headlights threw stark angles across the peeling boards and outbuildings. The windows were dark. No dog barked. No human figure moved to greet them. Sheriff Art Schley and his deputies stepped into the brittle cold. They had come with a search warrant based on the antifreeze receipt and the blood trail at the Worden hardware store. In the gathering dark, the Gein place looked forlorn. But no one expected what they were about to see. A deputy swung open the door to a shed near the barn. The beam of his flashlight traced the rough walls and then froze. From a ceiling crossbeam hung the lifeless body of Bernice Worden. She had been decapitated. Her body split open like a butchered deer and strung upside down. The sight stunned even the veteran officers. Several turned away, retching in the cold air. The deputies pressed on, forcing the door to the farmhouse. Inside, the stench of decay mixed with the sour odor of kerosene heaters and unwashed cloth. Dust and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. The rooms Augusta Gein had once occupied were still sealed, heavy with dust. Ed's own living spaces, the kitchen, a cluttered back room, looked like a scavenger's den. Then the searches began to find the other things. In a box on a shelf lay human noses. On a chair seat, tan strips of human skin stretched and tacked. On the wall, masks, pale and stiff, fashioned from the faces of women. In a drawer, loose human bones. On the table, a bowl carved from a skull. In a bag, a collection of preserved female organs. In a corner, Mary Hogan's face, preserved like some terrible hunting trophy. All told, investigators recovered remains traced to at least 15 women. Many had been taken from graves. A few, like Hogan and Worden, were murdered. When the first reports reached the outside world, journalists rushed to Plainfield. The farmhouse was quickly dubbed a house of horrors, and the press branded Gein the Plainfield Ghoul. Deputies found Ed Gein later that night at a neighbor's house where he had gone to dinner. He surrendered quietly. In the sheriff's car, he sat silent, almost meek, as if a long ordeal had come to an end. At the county jail, he answered routine questions with politeness. He even offered to show officers the locations of certain graves he had disturbed. The ease with which he spoke unsettled his interrogators. In the days that followed, Sheriff Schley and state investigators questioned Gein at length. At first, he denied killing anyone. But confronted with the evidence, the body of Bernice Worden, the remains of Mary Hogan, the ghastly artifacts from the farmhouse, he began to talk. His voice, by some accounts, remained flat and matter-of-fact as he described his nocturnal excursions to cemeteries, his theft of body parts, his efforts to fashion a woman's suit. He claimed he often went into a sort of trance when robbing graves, later awakening to find the exhumed remains beside him. He said he chose women who resembled his mother. He told investigators he had not meant to kill Bernice Worden, that the shotgun discharged accidentally as he examined it in her store. Few believed that explanation. In the end, Gein admitted 2 killings: Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Worden in 1957. Everything else, he said, had come from graves. In 1957, forensic science was far less advanced than today. Many of the bones and skin fragments recovered from the Gein property could not be positively matched to individual victims. Investigators had to rely heavily on Gein's own admissions and on evidence of the cemetery disturbances he led them to. Pathologists and anthropologists from the State University were brought in to sort the remains. Their grim work highlighted the need for better evidence collection techniques, something that would later become a lesson of the case. For the citizens of Plainfield, the revelations were almost impossible to grasp. Farmers who had hired Ed for fence mending or who had let him babysit their children felt sickened. The little town became a focus of lurid national headlines. Funerals were re-examined, and some families insisted on checking the graves of loved ones. Fear and shame mixed in equal measure. Reporters camped along the county roads, filing stories that sometimes blurred fact and rumor. Tales of cannibalism circulated in the tabloids. There is no credible evidence Gein ever consumed human flesh, but the rumor stuck. Court-appointed psychiatrists soon concluded that Ed Gein suffered from severe mental illness, most often diagnosed as schizophrenia with psychotic delusions. He had an intense, conflicted attachment to his domineering mother. He seemed to believe that by using parts of dead women to fashion a suit, he could in some way become his mother or keep her spirit near. Doctors also described him as socially stunted, with little understanding of sexuality and an almost childlike emotional range. He was not judged to be a sadistic sexual killer in the usual sense. His crimes grew out of delusion, grief, and obsession. In January 1958, a judge ruled him unfit to stand trial and committed him to Wisconsin's Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. A decade passed. Gein lived quietly under hospital supervision, taking part in occupational therapy and reading magazines. By the late 1960s, doctors deemed him competent to face trial. The proceedings opened in November 1968 in Washara County Court. By then, public outrage had ebbed into a somber curiosity. The evidence was overwhelming. The only real question was Gein's mental state at the time of Bernice Worden's killing. On November 14, 1968, the jury found Ed Gein guilty of first-degree murder but also legally insane. The verdict returned him to a state mental institution rather than a prison. He was never tried for the murder of Mary Hogan or for the grave robberies. The state judged that further prosecutions would serve no purpose. Gein spent the rest of his life in secure hospitals, first at Central State in Waupun, later at Mendota Mental Health Institute. Nurses and orderlies described him as a quiet, sometimes helpful patient. He liked to read detective magazines and farm journals, to play board games, to do small chores. He remained largely compliant with staff. In the mid-1970s, he was occasionally visited by journalists or true crime authors, to whom he answered questions in a detached manner. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory and heart failure due to cancer. He was 77. He was buried beside his parents and brother in Plainfield Cemetery. Over the years, souvenir hunters repeatedly chipped pieces from his headstone until it was eventually removed for safekeeping. In March 1958, while Gein was awaiting psychiatric evaluation, his property was to be auctioned. On the night before the auction, the farmhouse burned to the ground. Investigators suspected arson but never charged anyone. Many locals believe the blaze was set deliberately to erase the dreadful landmark. The charred site was later cleared and eventually became an empty field. The Gein case reverberated far beyond rural Wisconsin. In 1959, novelist Robert Bloch, living in the same state, loosely based his novel Psycho on the idea of a lonely man dominated by his mother's memory. Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film adaptation fixed that image in popular culture. The notion of furniture and masks made from human skin helped inspire the grotesque character of Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974. Later, the fictional killer Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs 1991 echoed Gein's desire to create a skin suit. These depictions often exaggerated or distorted the historical Gein, turning a socially stunted, delusional grave robber and two-time murderer into a chainsaw-wielding monster. Yet the seed of their horror lay in the plain facts of the 1957 discovery. For criminologists, the Gein investigation underscored several lessons. The importance of early recognition and treatment of severe mental illness. The need for systematic forensic anthropology and evidence preservation in cases involving dismembered or decomposed remains. The recognition that violent crime can emerge in the most seemingly placid rural settings. For the people of Plainfield, the episode was a long-lasting wound, a reminder that someone outwardly mild and familiar can harbor unspeakable darkness. More than 6 decades later, the phrase Plainfield Ghoul still conjures a sense of unease. Yet the true story is also a study in human vulnerability, of a boy shaped by an oppressive household, of a community slow to see danger in eccentricity, of victims remembered too often only for the manner of their deaths. The story of Ed Gein is not just a tale of horror. It is a grim chapter in the history of American justice and psychiatry. It teaches that monstrous acts do not always spring from overtly monstrous people. It also reminds us that vigilance, compassion, and timely intervention in mental health crises can sometimes avert tragedy. If you found this in-depth investigation into the real story of Ed Gein, the Plainfield Ghoul, both informative and eye-opening, we invite you to support our channel. Like, share, and subscribe for more fact-checked, respectful true crime documentaries. Consider sharing it to help keep the memory of the victims alive and to support responsible, factual true crime storytelling. Learning these histories is part of preventing them from repeating. Your support helps us continue to bring you accurate and well-researched accounts of history's darkest cases, ensuring that the truth is remembered, the victims are honored, and the lessons of the past are never forgotten.